On a sleepy Sunday morning in 1941, the Hawaiian island of Oahu couldn't have looked any more peaceful or idyllic. Even with the fairly recent arrival of the United States Pacific Fleet, which had deployed to the island from San Diego to their new main base at Pearl Harbor, only seemed to harbinger nothing more than a display of US naval prestige. Arranged off Ford Island in a line were 7 of America's mightiest battleships. This part of the harbor had become known appropriately as Battleship Row, and the sight of these seemingly invincible battleships must have convinced all that America's might was unquestionable. And yet, the sun was rising, literally and figuratively, shining a spotlight on a vast fleet of aircraft that buzzed through the morning sky and into history. This is the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Even by early November, there were still hopes on both sides that war could somehow be averted at the last minute. On November 20th, the Japanese offered what they knew would be one final proposal that could avert war with the US and the British Empire. They offered to withdraw from Indochina and halt their expansion into Southeast China on the condition that the US lifted its crippling sanctions and supply 1 million gallons of aviation fuel. The US considered the offer unacceptable and issued a counter-demand that Japan had to unilaterally withdraw from mainland China. This was unthinkable to Tokyo, who now knew war was coming. Yamamoto, meanwhile, was already assembling his combined fleet of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. It included 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 2 battleships, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 fleet submarines, and 5 midget subs. The key component of this fleet was, of course, the 6 fleet carriers and their aircraft under the command of Admiral Nagumo. Together, these 6 ships embarked a force of over 400 aircraft. Overseeing the operation from the battleship Nagato, Yamamoto ordered this, the most powerful carrier force in history, out to sea on November 26, 1941, as the diplomatic situation looked unresolvable. But the avid gambler knew that this, his first roll of the dice, would be the most crucial and potentially the most problematic. His whole plan relied on surprise, but surely, given the tension between Tokyo and Washington, the US would realize such a vast fleet of ships were missing and begin searching for them. Upon discovering them sailing towards Hawaii, the Americans could realize what was happening and deploy their fleets and aircraft to intercept. His fleet had 12,000 miles to cover, which would take him nearly 2 weeks, providing there were no delays. But that gave a passing US aircraft or ship ample time to spot them. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean did afford them some protection, but even then, Yamamoto was taking no chances, having the fleet sail under total radio silence, only receiving coded broadcasts from Japan, fearing any transmission from the fleet could be intercepted. Ahead of the main fleet, Japanese submarines scanned the oceans looking for marauding US ships sailing in their path. However, on the American side, the US intelligence network was far more concerned about the Philippines. They were intercepting large numbers of communication between Japanese units and official sources across Asia, although it was often uncertain what they meant. However, observers in the Far East had noticed Japanese warships deploying out to sea in the beginning of December, as the Japanese made their preparation for their Asian and Pacific blitzkrieg. The US were therefore correctly anticipating the imminent Japanese attack on the Philippines, but had completely missed the part of the plan concerning an attack on Pearl Harbor. Less than 24 hours after Yamamoto's fleet had set sail, war warnings were issued to all US forces in the Pacific, but the measures the admirals and generals should take were not entirely clear. These war warnings were repeatedly issued over the coming days, which should have caused alarm, but as Admiral William Halsey, a man whose name would become synonymous with the Pacific Theater in the months to come, put it, there were so many of them that after a while people just became dulled to their impact and started to relax. Despite the belief that the Philippines was the Japanese's primary objective, Admiral Kimmel took what measures he could to guard the harbor, but it was not made any easier by the fact that his force of long-range maritime patrol aircraft had been repeatedly struck down in size as they were transferred to the Atlantic. He therefore lacked the aircraft to patrol the whole ocean around Oahu, and so instead, he concentrated their search efforts in the lanes in and out of the Pearl, and the areas where his warships conducted training. His reasoning for this was that he anticipated attacks from Japanese submarines once hostilities broke out, but this of course only aided in Yamamoto's efforts to approach the island undetected. Further inland meanwhile, U.S. Army Lieutenant General Walter C. Short interpreted the warnings from Washington as being less about a military attack by Japan's forces and more about acts of sabotage from the local Japanese immigrant population. He therefore increased security measures at his airfields, including bunching the aircraft closer together so they would be easier to guard. These orders were met with a rather incredulous response from many of the soldiers carrying out these duties, who knew the Japanese immigrants Short were referring to and didn't believe they would ever be involved in sabotage or supporting the Japanese Empire against the United States. The disjointed army and naval responses to the war warnings highlighted a glaring problem in terms of defending Oahu from attack, being that there was no one person in overall command of US forces stationed there. This, coupled with an almost dismissive attitude that was being taken towards the warnings issued, their lack of clarity on what to do, and the general belief that the fighting would start in the Philippines, meant that a direct attack on Pearl Harbor was the last thing anyone expected, and as such, adequate measures that could have been taken to blunt a surprise attack were ignored. The Americans opened the door for Yamamoto's aircraft to attack. On December 2nd, 1941, from the Nagato moored in Hiroshima Bay, Yamamoto ordered a transmission to be sent to the attack force. It said, "Climb Mount Nitaka." This was the order given to conduct the attack on Pearl Harbor. From the outset, Yamamoto had emphasized that the key to victory would be eliminating the 3 US carriers in their Pacific fleet. These were the USS Enterprise, the USS Saratoga, and the USS Lexington. But being moving airstrips at a time of crisis, they became very active in the final days of peace, and the window for catching all of them at once seemed to be slipping from Nagumo's grasp. Saratoga was back in the US, undergoing a major refit, and so was certain not to be at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, which left Enterprise and Lexington. Enterprise was next to go, when on November 28th, it slipped out of Pearl with orders to ferry 12 gunman F-4F Wildcat fighters of the US Marine Corps to Wake Island. Then, just 2 days before the attack commenced, Lexington II was employed in delivering aircraft, this time to Midway Island. Thus, as the Japanese fleet approached, they were dismayed that the carriers would not be present. This was the whole idea of the attack, to knock these carriers out of the battle before they could lead America to victory. The Japanese had gambled everything to get here, and the most important targets were completely out of the firing line. Nevertheless, the attack was ordered to go ahead anyway. They could still inflict a powerful blow against the American fleet, which would only further weaken them in any future confrontation, where the 3 carriers could be destroyed using overwhelmingly superior Japanese numbers. On the evening of December 6th, 1941, in the last hours of peace, American codebreakers began intercepting a flood of coded transmissions across the Pacific. Unsure what it all meant, as they did not have the full picture yet, they expected the Japanese to attack Southeast Asia and the Philippines. But a warning to that end doesn't reach Pearl Harbor before the sun starts to rise over Oahu. 345 hours. On the north of the island of Oahu, an alarm rings out inside the tents of Privates George E. Elliott Jr. and Joseph L. Lockhart. But this is not a warning of any kind. Rather, it is the sound of the alarm clock, rousing them to begin their duties at their radar station, assembled on the north of the island. Their radar site is one of 6 mobile units, comprising just 4 vehicles, carrying the antennae, power generator, and support equipment that had been assembled around Oahu, intended to give as wide a coverage as possible. Located some 532 feet above sea level at a site known as Opana, the two radar operators have an excellent view of the ocean for their SCR-270 radar antennae to scan for aircraft. The two men are working a 24-hour shift at the site, but only operate the radar in the morning between 0400 hours and 0700 hours, and even then, it is primarily for training purposes. The rest of the time they spend carrying out maintenance or guarding the site against vandals and snooping locals. Unlike the stereotypical image of a radar screen with a circular dish and a beam traversing round and round like a searchlight, this early radar set instead employs an oscilloscope for display that produces spikes whenever an object is detected. It can only tell them something is there. It can't tell them who it is. 357 hours. Around the waters of Oahu, one of the few US warships at sea in the early hours is the Wicks-class destroyer USS Ward, under the command of Lieutenant Commander William W. Outerbridge, who only assumed the captaincy of the ship 2 days before. Lookouts on the Ward spot another warship, the minesweeper USS Condor, which begins signaling that they believed they had spotted a periscope in the water, and so Outerbridge orders his men to begin searching for a possible Japanese submarine. 600 hours. The first wave of Japanese planes begin taking off from their carriers under the leadership of Commander Mitsuo Fushida. It consists of 183 planes and comprises of 3 groups. 2 of the groups have orders to attack the surrounding airfields around Pearl, allowing the primary group to go in and attack Battleship Row. According to the battleship USS Nevada, Ensign Joseph K. Taussig Jr. is awoken to take command of the forenoon watch. Being officer of the deck on a quiet Sunday morning in port is usually tedious, and so Taussig racked his brain looking for something to do. It then struck him that only one boiler had been lit to power the ship since they had entered Pearl, and therefore he decided to order another to be lit, if only to give him and the duty personnel something to do. 630 hours. Out at sea, another group of monoplane dive bombers are taking off from the deck of a carrier, but these are not Japanese aircraft, rather American. Sailing over 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor is the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, and it is in the process of launching a formation of 18 Douglas SBD dive bombers. The Enterprise should have already entered Pearl Harbor, but a storm has delayed them by 24 hours. The SBDs have been ordered to conduct a patrol of the area before landing on Ford Island. 637 hours. Lookouts aboard the USS Ward sight another American ship, this time a US Navy supply ship, the Antares, sailing towards the entrance of Pearl, with a 500-ton barge in tow. The Antares is expecting to meet a tugboat that should relieve it of the barge, but when it fails to arrive on time, the Antares instead has to alter course to the east to keep the entrance to Pearl clear until the tug appears. However, as the ship turns, crew members notice a small white wake apparently trailing behind them. Realizing it is a periscope, the Antares quickly signals its location to the USS Ward, and sensing an attack, Outerbridge orders his crew to general quarters and moves to intercept the submarine. An orbiting PBY Catalina also swoops down on the scene, dropping smoke bombs to mark the target's location. The Ward opens fire with its 4-inch deck guns, before using its higher speed to overtake the sub and drop depth charges, which destroys the Japanese vessel, killing its 2 crew members. Outerbridge immediately sends a coded transmission to Pearl Harbor, outlining the attack, but after delays decoding the message, it is presented to Admiral Kimmel, who demands verification that it is genuine and not a false alarm. 700 hours. Unaware of the drama that has unfolded out at sea, Privates Elliott and Lockhart are coming to the end of their watch and are looking forward to the arrival of the relief crew and breakfast. Elliott, who is new to their unit, has spent most of the time at the plotting table, where he would mark any tracks Lockhart spotted on a map before relaying the information back to headquarters, although there had been none thus far. While they wait for the truck that will carry them back to their base, the 2 men decide to get in some extra training as a way of killing some time, whereby Elliott will man the oscilloscope under Lockhart's guidance. Scanning the horizon, the oscilloscope only draws a flat line like it had for much of the morning, indicating that it isn't detecting anything, But then, suddenly and unexpectedly, it spikes. Examining the reading for himself, Lockhart is amazed at the size of the spike, which indicates to him a large number of aircraft, more than he has ever seen at one time. The men immediately contact Fort Shafter in Honolulu to report their findings, speaking to Private Joseph McDonald, who's looking for Lieutenant Kermit Tyler in the plotting room. Tyler dismisses the report as nothing, much to the incredulity of Lockhart. He insists they are detecting a large formation of aircraft approaching Oahu, and recognizing the concern in the young radar operator's voice, McDonald gets back to Tyler and insists he speaks directly to him. Lieutenant Tyler again tells Lockhart and Elliot to ignore the track because he knows they're expecting a group of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers to fly in from the US to Wheeler Field. Neither Lockhart, Elliot, nor McDonald are satisfied with this, but they have to follow the orders of their superior officer. Relieved of duty a few minutes later, McDonald returns to his tent with a grim expression on his face, and when asked what was wrong by a fellow soldier, he replies, "The Japs are coming." 726 hours. The destroyer USS Helm casts off from its mooring to begin a day of routine maintenance work on the various buoys scattered in and around the harbor. 740 hours. Elliot and Lockhart lose contact with the formation of aircraft they had detected over half an hour earlier. A truck soon arrives to take them back to their main base, arriving just as the sound of explosions ring out over Oahu. 748 hours. Commander Mitsuo Fushida orders his men to begin their attack. As the men of the Pacific Fleet groggily awake, the harbor begins to buzz with the sound of aero engines. Even now, many of them are blissfully unaware of the imminent danger, attributing the aircraft to being either Navy or Army pilots conducting some early morning training. On ships like the USS Nevada, bands are playing as the morning flag hoisting ceremony gets underway. It's only as the first explosions begin to roar that they finally realize what is happening. The Japanese have caught the Americans at Pearl Harbor completely and totally by surprise. Battleship Row bears the brunt of the initial attacks, with the USS Oklahoma being hit by 2 torpedoes that cause significant damage to the battleship's hull. A few minutes later, a 3rd torpedo strikes the warship and nearly capsizes it. In the opening minutes of the attack, the USS West Virginia takes 7 torpedo hits from modified Type 91 torpedoes, whilst almost simultaneously, the USS California takes 2. Then the Japanese level bombers make their attacks. Some 10 Japanese bombers target the USS Arizona with modified 1,760-pound armor-piercing shells, which strike the ship to devastating effect. One of the bombs detonates near the ship's magazines, resulting in a powerful explosion that effectively cuts the ship in 2. Nearby, the heavy cruiser USS Helena is hit by a torpedo after the attacking Japanese pilot mistook the vessel for Admiral Kimmel's flagship, the battleship Pennsylvania, in the low light. The blast from this hit damages the mine layer USS Oglala, which begins taking on water, and efforts to stop the ship sinking are thwarted by repeated strafing attacks by Japanese aircraft. Another cruiser, the USS Relay, also receives a torpedo hit and begins listing as it takes on water. Immediately, the US sailors scramble to their defensive positions and begin returning fire, claiming a handful of Japanese aircraft. However, the gunners in Battleship Row have a tough time aiming at the Japanese planes because the warships are so closely packed together that there is a risk of spraying each other with bullets. On board many of the ships returning fire, ammunition supplies quickly run low, sometimes within minutes, leaving crew members scrambling to bring up new supplies from the ship's stores. As if all this were not enough, the American air opposition at Pearl Harbor is so low that Japanese Zero fighters take to strafing the defensive gunners with bullets. Further inland, as the first bombs began raining down on Pearl, the Army airfields at Barbers Point, Bellows, Hickam, and Wheeler come under attack, bombs landing amongst the aircraft bunched up to protect them from local saboteurs, causing immense damage. At Wheeler Field, pilots like Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen are still wearing their pajamas as they pick up whatever weapons they can find to fire into the air at the Japanese planes. During a lull in the attack on the field, Rasmussen and his comrades assess the damage. Large numbers of their P-38 and P-40 fighters are burning, but miraculously, a handful have seemingly escaped undamaged, and so they hurriedly arm and fuel them before lifting off. Despite being heavily outnumbered, and with Rasmussen's own P-36 being less than a match for the Japanese Zero, and having a gun jammed, he still manages to bring down one of the Japanese fighters. In all, the pilots from Wheeler managed to bring down 11 Japanese planes, but this was only a drop in the ocean compared to the total force being brought against them. In the midst of the attack, the SBDs from the Enterprise arrive over Pearl Harbor and can't believe what they're seeing. Almost immediately, they are set upon not just by Japanese aircraft, but by American gunners who have trouble distinguishing them from the similar-looking Japanese carrier bombers, result in 7 being shot down before they manage to land. Not long after, the B-17s Lieutenant Tyler was expecting to arrive are also fired upon by both Japanese pilots and American gunners. Many of the aircraft take damage, and with Hickam Field under heavy air attack, the bombers divert to nearby airfields. 817 hours. The destroyer USS Helm, which was set to undertake maintenance of the harbor's buoys, turns to leave the harbor as the attack continues. As the destroyer leaves the inlet for the open sea, where it can at least maneuver as it is attacked, a lookout spots an object snared on a nearby reef and soon identifies it as one of the 2-man midget submarines. Turning to starboard, Helm opens fire on the midget submarine, but misses, and the small submersible soon escapes. However, it would not be gone for long, as it quickly snags on the reef again. Eventually, the 2 men on board will abandon the submarine, resulting in one of them drowning, and the other, Kazuzo Sakamaki, becoming the United States' first Japanese prisoner of war. 827 hours. The USS Monaghan, a destroyer, was ordered to head out to sea to assist the Ward shortly before the attack began, and as such, came under attack as it got moving. Attempting to leave the harbor, it spots another of the midget submarines attempting to attack the fleet, and its captain orders full speed ahead in an attempt to ram it. Missing the submarine by just 50 yards, the destroyer then drops depth charges into the water that is so shallow, the resulting blast lifts its stern out of the water, damaging the steering mechanism. Out of control, the ship crashes into a barge, but only suffers minor damage. 830 hours. Aboard the destroyer USS Alwyn, the crew are scrambling to get the ship moving and away from the dock so as not to be a sitting duck. With much of the crew on shore leave, including all the senior officers, Alwyn begins steaming away with less than 50% of its regular crew on board, and with a young ensign, Stanley B. Kaplan, in command. Kaplan has barely been at sea for 8 months, and now he is commanding a destroyer under heavy fire, attempting to escape the carnage. Shortly after the destroyer begins moving, lookouts spot the ship's captain boarding a motor launch with several other officers before attempting to reach them. But Kaplan is under orders from the commander of the destroyer force at Pearl to not stop or slow down, and he leaves the men behind. Gunners on his first command firing at Japanese planes above as he leads Alwyn out to sea. After nearly 3/4 of an hour of almost continuous air attack, Battleship Row is left ablaze as the first wave of Japanese warplanes finish their attacks and head back to their carriers. But the second wave is not far behind. 840 hours. Despite having taken a torpedo hit that causes heavy flooding, the battleship USS Nevada is able to come up to power thanks to Ensign Tausig's decision to light another of the ship's boilers. What should have taken 2 hours to get moving only takes 40 minutes, and the mighty battleship breaks free of its moorings and is no longer a sitting duck for the Japanese. 854 hours. The second wave of attacks begin with a Japanese force consisting of 35 fighters, 78 dive bombers, and 54 high-altitude bombers. However, now the American forces are fully engaged and meet the second wave head-on. Most of the Japanese losses incurred on December 7th are amongst the second wave, who do not have the benefit of total surprise, and this does not go unnoticed by Admiral Nagumo. 950 hours. Defending itself from repeated attacks by Japanese dive bombers, the USS Nevada is attempting to make for the open sea when it's struck by 5 Japanese 250-kilogram bombs. The Japanese are making a determined effort to sink the battleship in the channel leading to Pearl, hoping that it would block entry and exit, further exacerbating the damage they have inflicted on American forces at Oahu. By themselves, these light bombs cause significant damage to the battleship, but not enough to sink it. However, they do start fires that are now as big a threat to its hard-pressed crew as the Japanese. 1,000 hours. Their bombs, bullets, and torpedoes expended and low on fuel, the final Japanese pilots begin returning to their aircraft carriers, expecting to be loaded up to participate in the third wave of attacks. However, much to the dismay of many of them, Admiral Nagumo has cancelled the third wave of strikes. Nagumo reasoned that much of their objective, excluding the carriers, had already been achieved, and given that the Americans were now fully prepared for more attacks, he would be sacrificing many of his pilots and aircraft unnecessarily, which would weaken his force further, all of whom will be needed when the inevitable battle with the American carriers comes. Once all of his aircraft are recovered to the carrier decks, he orders the fleet to retreat. Of the 350 aircraft he has sent into battle that morning, 29 have been lost, a relatively small figure for the damage that has been inflicted. 1,030 hours. Despite the Herculean efforts of the crew of the Nevada to escape Pearl Harbor, the fires caused by the bombs have prevented damage control teams from tackling the flooding, and fearing the battleship will sink, her crew are ordered to drive the ship onto shore on nearby Ford Island. With the help of a tug and a small minesweeper, the Nevada hits the shore at Hospital Point and is no longer mobile. President Roosevelt was alerted of the events at Pearl Harbor soon after they began. Given the time difference between Oahu and Washington, it was the early afternoon when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox burst into a meeting the president was having with one of his advisors, Harry Hopkins, to tell him the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor. Recounting that momentous day, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt remembered that her husband presented a dead calm demeanor as he received the latest information from the scene, but she knew deep down that he was incensed by the attack, given all that he had done to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis with Japan. Furthermore, it was the way in which Japan had begun this war that further incensed him and his cabinet. An insulting 7.5 hours after the bombs began raining down on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese delivered their declaration of war against the United States and Great Britain. Among those he conferred with regarding the attack was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in London, who also found his country at war with Japan that day. Coinciding with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had attacked British Far Eastern possessions such as Hong Kong, leading to the Prime Minister uttering to Roosevelt, "We are all in the same boat now." Assessing the situation and what the days ahead might entail, Roosevelt confided in Eleanor that he expected Germany to soon follow in their Japanese allies' footsteps and declare war on the United States. Almost repeating Yamamoto's own predictions, Roosevelt told her that the United States was in no way prepared to fight the war they were now embroiled in, and that it would take time to reorganize American industry from producing cars and refrigerators to making tanks and bombs. He therefore said to her that in his opinion, the country would, quote, "have to take a good many defeats before we can have a victory." Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor Roosevelt went on the radio that night for her weekly scheduled program. To an audience of shocked, angry, and frightened listeners, she reassured them by stating, quote, "Whatever is asked of us, we shall accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the USA." While she was speaking to the American people in their homes, her husband was with his secretary Grace Tully, dictating a speech he planned to give the next day to US Congress. In the evening, he and his cabinet met, where they discussed the latest reports from Pearl Harbor. The news was horrifying. Casualty reports were rising exponentially with every message from the scene, and with so many ships damaged or sunk at once, the US Navy's Pacific Fleet had been dealt a significant blow in the crucial opening round of the conflict. The saving grace was that the US carriers had, miraculously, all been spared. After a restless night's sleep, Roosevelt addressed Congress at 12:30 p.m. on December 8,
that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Within an hour, Congress had voted to reciprocate the declaration of war on Japan. The vote was almost unanimous, save for one lone voice, that of Jeannette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, and the first woman to hold federal office in the US. Rankin voted against the declaration and refused to be pressured by the other representatives, even when they publicly booed and hissed at her from the gallery. Explaining her reasoning, she said, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." Back at Pearl Harbor, the carrier USS Enterprise sailed solemnly into Pearl Harbor on the afternoon of December 8th, where the crew saw firsthand the devastation they had only narrowly escaped themselves. The day before, they had launched an attack wave of planes after a possible sighting of the Japanese fleet, but found nothing. And now, eager to get revenge, or at least not be caught idle in a second attack on the Pearl, every man scrambled to refuel, rearm, and resupply the carrier so it could head back out to sea, as news of the invasion of the Philippines spread across the Pacific. For all who were there, and for all who weren't, across America and American possessions across the world, there was only one thing on their minds: avenge Pearl Harbor. (2,335 US service personnel and 68 civilians were killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. A further 1,178 were wounded. The Japanese sank 4 battleships and seriously damaged 4 others, along with a number of cruisers and other supporting vessels, while some 390 aircraft were destroyed. And yet the survival of the American carriers meant, ultimately, the attack would only buy Japan the 6 months Yamamoto predicted was needed to decisively defeat the Allies. This was something Japan would fail to do. At the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, 4 of the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor would be lost to American air power. It would be a defeat Japan would never recover from, and would provide the catalyst for the eventual fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945. Pearl Harbor left an indelible impression on the United States after World War II, particularly as the Cold War began with the Soviet Union. The US constantly feared being caught off guard in another surprise attack, but this time involving nuclear weapons, and so invested billions of dollars in early warning systems and intelligence-gathering technologies. They also instigated a massive rearmament program to confront the Soviets, so that, unlike on December 7th, 1941, the US was always geared up to fight any war that might break out. But in an effort to prevent that from happening in the first place, the United States also adopted a much more aggressive foreign policy in countering the Soviets than it did with countering the Japanese in the 1930s. With all these wartime lessons having been learned, many historians have asked questions over whether or not the US should have been aware of an attack being underway. Was key evidence overlooked, or as some have suggested, deliberately ignored? Like many major events in history, Pearl Harbor has bred conspiracy theories, ranging from the plausible to the downright absurd, that nevertheless continue to be argued about to this very day. Specifically, whether Roosevelt knew the attack was going to happen prior to December 7th. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that Pearl Harbor was more than just an attack on the United States. In a single stroke, it altered the course of world history, catapulting America into World War II and its position today. Probably the most influential and certainly most powerful nation on the face of the earth.